Bruxelles,
Paris,
Madrid.
Hi, this is Hermine, and I'm back with a new series where we're going to look at the future of military. After decades of peace, we're now facing some pretty tough times. The EU's relationship with Washington, its long-standing ally, has been dealt a serious blow, and trust levels are at an all-time low. Moscow is showing its European ambitions on our doorstep, and meanwhile, Beijing's power is growing further afield. European countries have long relied on the United States for their defense within NATO, and they're heavily dependent on the US for their heavy transport capabilities and technology. But now Washington's putting pressure on them to up their military budgets. Against this backdrop, European countries have no choice but to learn to be more self-reliant in defense matters. It's hard to imagine Europe entering a new era of war. But in this crazy and unpredictable world we live in, it's wise to bear this in mind. But what might the war of tomorrow look like, and how should we prepare for it? Spanish cybersecurity expert Ramon Rico explains what the word war means to him these days.
We're witnessing a fairly clear evolution of the concept of war. Historically, when we think of conflicts, we think of territory, weapons, and ultimately armies. But today, I believe that this is also measured by information, data, and technological capabilities. A war, therefore, no longer begins when the news breaks or there is an invasion, but in fact much earlier. It begins in a quieter way, with preparing the ground both digitally and psychologically.
Some people would even say that we're already at war. What with the plethora of hybrid threats we're facing, like cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage, and other disruptive activities. Let's hear what José María Gil-Garre, a Spanish expert in security and strategic analysis, has to say on this.
We are in a moment of what we call a hybrid conflict, a hybrid war that can manifest itself at some point through more overt violent actions, perhaps with unknown actors obscured by sabotage operations. We have seen how a country was partitioned through a cyber attack, as in Estonia in 2007, or how cyber attacks during COVID-19 paralyzed hospital intensive care unit systems, leading to a loss of life. It is true that people see war as something that manifests itself in a very obvious, outwardly aggressive way, but relationships develop, commercial, economic, technological relationships, in this grey area. We must conceptualize this spectrum of uncertainty in some way in order to understand it quickly, and this is what we call hybrid warfare.
Traditional ground conflict is still a thing, obviously, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But now, artificial intelligence is bringing to the battle some pretty sci-fi-esque combat scenarios. Take drones, for example. They are being used more and more as combatants. And they make conventional military formations pretty vulnerable. Professor Andrea Locatelli, who teaches strategic studies at Milan's Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, says that drones are definitely a game changer.
What is certain is that if you don't have drones, you can't use them. And if you can't use them, you will most likely be at a disadvantage. So the point, of course, is to first work out how many drones are needed and what type, because drones can be very cheap.
But so if drones are that cheap, it won't cost us so much to rearm, will it? Professor Locatelli says this way of looking at the issue is a bit too simple.
A drone that costs little on its own is of little use if it isn't accompanied by something technologically advanced.
This advanced tech is, for example, when they're operating in jammed environments where GPS is blocked. The AI and anti-jamming tech needed for this is really expensive. Satellites are really important here. They act like a bridge in space, enabling real-time adjustments to flight paths, sensor manipulation, remote weapon deployment, and the transmission of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance data. They've basically become the nervous system that lets drones operate beyond line of sight. This basically extends the battlefield into space, where satellites are targeted every week. So space must also be defended, which is expensive. On top of this, We're in a global race for counter-drone, or as they say, counter-UAS technology. Finally, I'd just like to add that AI, in its most futuristic form, will most likely start fighting alongside our armed forces as literal comrades in arms. But as in the best sci-fi films, can we be sure that all AI soldiers will follow orders? TARS, from Christopher Nolan's Inception, is the perfect example for loyal agents. But the terrifying HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey turns on its crew when they become a threat to its mission. We're in a whole new world now, where our wildest fantasies and our worst nightmares are becoming reality, although Locatelli puts this in more measured terms.
L'allure dell'intelligenza artificiale.
The appeal of artificial intelligence is like that of ChatGPT or other software for students at school. It can quickly do something that is tedious, and it does it well. Without supervision, an unqualified student misuses artificial intelligence and gets a bad mark. A skilled student uses it well and gets a good mark. So everything very much depends on the individual.
The world's big powers have been advancing full steam ahead towards integrating AI into their armies. Earlier this year, Washington's Department of War launched an AI deployment strategy to make the country an AI-first war-fighting force across all domains. Agentic AI, a type of AI capable of independent decision-making, mission planning, and real-time navigation, is central to these plans. And Washington plans to develop, among other things, a network of AI agents for, and I quote, AI-enabled battle management and decision support from campaign planning to kill chain execution, end of quote. And the US government is putting its money where its mouth is, with record levels of military expenditure planned for 2026. Incredibly, its total defense-related spending is projected to exceed $1 trillion. Are we ready to follow this path in Europe? Probably not yet. One challenge is that public opinion, particularly in Western Europe, has not yet come to terms with the necessity of these investments, perhaps understandably after more than 70 years of peace. The more we hear about how AI technology is already being used in operation, usually far from the camera's lenses, the more uncomfortable many of us feel, though. Professor Locatelli cites the example of Lavender, the AI system used by the Israeli forces to identify and generate potential human targets during the Gaza war.
Attribuisce un punteggio a delle persone.
What does this software do? It assigns a score to people. There is a kind of monitoring of the Palestinian population. In short, this software has the advantage of collecting a huge amount of data on people and defining a sort of threat ranking. The higher the score, the more likely that person will need to be eliminated based on the military objectives. The personnel assigned to this function were said to have approximately 20 seconds to decide whether to strike or not. This means that the responsibility lies with a person, but in fact, the person delegates the decision to the machine. A machine that, in the early stages of the operation, when there was greater supervision, showed a 90% success rate. This, of course, means that there were 10% of people who most likely had nothing to do with anything and were still hit.
So military spending is moving away from traditional heavy material like tanks and ships towards smart materials such as stealth drones or loitering munitions, also known as suicide drones, and dual-use technologies, meaning that they serve both civilian and military purposes. But I guess it's good news that the military will be kept away from the front line, right? Member of the European Parliament, Laurent Vince, from the centre-right group, confirms but says there's more to it.
Technology can save lives through deterrence and precision, but it risks making war more politically acceptable because your own soldiers are less exposed, have been replaced by machines. Take the intervention in Venezuela, or the punctual interventions in Iran and so on, which raise other questions.
So quite obviously, we're going to be hit with plenty of moral and philosophical questions as technology further develops. This is why preparing for the next generation of war also means setting boundaries. Dr. Olivier Del Fabbro, a lecturer at ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, calls for the international laws of war to be adapted in line with these technological developments.
The greatest danger associated with the use of drones in our conflicts is escalation. What I mean is that some might say, okay, now we're going to automate completely because otherwise we'll be at a disadvantage. That's why it is so crucial to clarify at the international level and in international law how war can be waged. Frameworks already exist. The ICRC, for example, is doing a lot of work in this area. It is essential to integrate AI into political, social, and legal contexts. This is paramount.
And former Portuguese Defense Minister José Acevedo Lopes shares this view.
There is a very brutal side to current conflicts, which, incidentally, has led to a dramatic decline in compliance with the rules of international humanitarian law. One need only look at a report released recently by the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights to see that across the board, we are grossly disregarding what we once accepted as indisputable. Note that several countries in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the Nordic countries and Poland, for example, have withdrawn from a convention banning anti-personnel mines. This speaks volumes about the fragility of our convictions.
He also reminds us that no matter how shiny the new tech is, it cannot replace the old principles of international combat.
What is the problem with artificial intelligence? It is that we are somewhat dazzled by it. That is, when we see a new technology, we quickly forget that if that new technology is coupled with weapons systems, a fundamental principle continues to apply, the one set out in Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which states that when a new weapons system emerges, it is not, by definition, good simply because it is new. It must be tested in terms of its actual or potential compliance with the basic principles of international humanitarian law, namely the principle of distinguishing between the civilian population and the combatant population.
Swiss researcher Olivier Del Fabbro in turn calls for new laws to set in stone the human-in-the-loop principle.
A human being must always be involved in decisions and be able to intervene. In my opinion, this should also be enshrined in law. Just as there are international treaties on nuclear weapons, a similar approach should be adopted for AI. Work is already underway in this direction, but we must push ahead with it.
So what's happening right now in Europe? The bloc's rearmament project is reflected in the Rearm Europe, also called Readiness 2030 package, which aims to mobilize more than 800 billion euros in defense investment, industrial capabilities and joint procurement. In addition, Brussels is allowing EU member states to spend up to 1.5% of their GDP on defense without breaking their budget rules. A new financial instrument, SAVE, worth about 150 billion euros, has also been introduced to support joint procurement and industrial scale-up. At least 19 EU countries have already applied for funds, with joint procurement also open to non-EU European countries and Canada. And when it comes to upgrading our military equipment, it's more important than ever to make sure we can supply our own rare earths and minerals. The search for these raw materials, along with the usual arguments over who gets to control hydrocarbon supplies, is making things more and more violent, and the major powers compete to get their hands on resources and territory. The disagreement between Europe and Washington over who should control Greenland and its fertile lands is a pretty uncomfortable example of this. And here, we've got to make some tough choices. It doesn't make sense to want to be independent and at the same time be buying weapons, gas and AI chips from the US to keep Washington happy, or does it? Whatever happens with the world, it's pretty clear that we're heading for some pretty big changes, so it better be ready for them. But can one ever be ready for war? Not according to Dimitar Rangel. He's a rep for the Dutch police and their academy, working closely with the Dutch Ministry of Justice, the armed forces and other partners across Europe. He and his team developed dual-use technologies and applications, software solutions and other innovations both in civilian and military context, for the protection of infrastructure, facilities and individuals.
Няма как да си готов за дадена война.
You can't ever be fully ready for a specific war. Technology evolves, society evolves, public attitudes evolve. We are never really ready for change in any form. Every year it snows, and every year the snow still takes us by surprise.
Ready or not, we may all need to get our snow shovels out. The interviews, which were carried out across Europe, were conducted by my colleagues from the Euranet Plus network, Aitana from Radio Castilla y León, Julia from Radio 24 in Italy, Stefan from Radio Romagna, Alexandra from Bulgarian National Radio, Jean-Claude from Luxembourg Station 100.7, and Alejandro from Renascença in Portugal. And finally, Monica edited this podcast. Thank you all for your precious work and collaboration. Next week, we're going to be looking at intelligence and spies. And clearly, there's a big change here. James Bond may have some cool gadgets, but the names bot is a new trend. Make sure to listen.